You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Today I'm here with Stew Redwine, who's the VP of Creative Services at Oxford Road, who specializes in audio advertising of all types, but in particular, recently, they've really quadrupled down on podcasts. So let's start off, Stu, with what Oxford Road has provided in services for clients since you've been there about 7.5 years, like how that's changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kevin, for having me on, for sure. So I like to say at Oxford Road, I've been there since before the beginning, because I was doing contract work before I joined full-time,
right?
7 years ago. How it's changed, we started out, the way the agency started was out of iHeartMedia. There was a sales team that was operating inside of there. Our founder, Dan Granger, was looking for new ways to grow advertisers in Los Angeles, direct-to-consumer advertisers, and there was this thing called podcast, right? So we're talking 9-10 years ago. So how can we, how does this whole thing work? And as you know, the story of podcast, even then, back then it's like, what is this? But it was working fabulously because of that direct connection with the host, with the audience. And it started to grow and grow. Dan took that step, founded Oxford Road. I would say the main way that it has changed over the years is like every startup story ever. I'm sure you understand, it's like we're building the airplane in flight. We were trying all sorts of different things at the beginning. I would say the thing I've noticed the most recently has been a real discipline and a focus when it comes to the messaging in minimalism. We used to give the host 100 pages and try all of this, try all that. How can we be consistent? How can we be really focused? And how can we provide them the most succinct, sharply pointed copy points possible in order for them to bring our advertisers to their audiences?
That's really cool. And you mentioned DTC as sort of being one of the early sort of client groups that you had, and DTC marketers in particular are really concerned about whether or not things are working or not, right? And yes. I know recently you guys really launched into the whole performance marketing measurement side with Audiolytics. And was that driven off of the DTC advertiser?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been a audio performance marketing agency from day one. That's what we've been all about, right? So you come out of radio where, spots and dots, how do we make this thing work? How does it pencil? Direct to consumer brands, they've spent their money in digital. We're looking for new worlds to conquer. So they bring it over into audio. Well, the question is, it's the age-old Wanamaker quote attributed to Wanamaker. I know half of my ads are working. I just don't know which half. So how do I know that this ad is working in audio? The good news is people have been working on persuading each other with audio for a long time, right? Like back to Aristotle's rhetoric, where he breaks it down to logos, ethos, pathos. That's how I'm going to persuade you. In his book, Rhetoric, a person is not fully persuaded until they consider something demonstrated. Like, we have been working on this a long time. Audiolytics is the framework that we use at Oxford Road, and born at the beginning. Like I said, I've been involved since the beginning, but full-time 7 years to go, okay, can we break down into component pieces and identify what it is that makes a message as persuasive as possible? That is what Audiolytics is. It's 9 key components that you would recognize in other formulas out there, but we've brought it all together to go 9 key components, 71 subcomponents that when I go through a piece of copy, we're checking to go, how many of these are in there? And then you layer on top of that. At the beginning, this wasn't there, obviously, because we didn't have the media spend, hundreds of millions of dollars of media that gives us weighting on those subcomponents to then fully tune up to make a message as absolutely persuasive as possible, like you're saying, born out of performance audio.
Right. So, it's still surprisingly fast moving in the world of podcasts. I mean, there's still lots of people jumping in. You've got sort of the mega podcasts like the Joe Rogans of the world, and then you've got lots and lots of niche podcasts. So what's most exciting for you right now as far as what's going on within that ecosystem?
The key word you had in that sentence, growth. It's the growth. because with that comes, it's the early stages, it's the Wild West, and that's exciting in and of itself. The first folks to go out west and build the new settlements and, conquer the wild, and so to speak. But then like a really, really fun time is when the roads are getting paved, they're bringing in electricity, they're bringing in water. Like that's a whole other stage. And so for me, it's the growth right now, that it's a space that at one point, like the shorthand for podcast, I kind of look at it as like, have you listened to Serial? Like that was basically like shorthand for like, do you even know what podcasts are? Now it's becoming something that more people are talking about. That means there's more investment. And so that means there's a lot more opportunities.
One thing that's happened over the last few years is it's been really interesting in the podcast consumption, experience has changed, right? So pre-pandemic podcasts also occurred during drive time because people were substituting podcasts for their drive time radio, terrestrial radio or satellite radio. And then during the pandemic, a lot of people stopped commuting. And so the usage of the podcasts in the vehicle changed. And now it's gotten sort of back to some people are sort of hybrid or getting back to work. They're spending more times in cars during drive time or whatever passes for drive time these days with flexible work schedules. So how do you think that is impacting the trajectory of the podcast ecosystem, the fact that people are sort of getting back in their cars again?
I think you're seeing, I mean, there was a report recently that the average podcast length is 37 minutes. Guess what? The average commute time in this country is 35 to 45 minutes.
Right.
That's what you're going to see. Pandemic, we're all at home for the large part, but in general, the all of our experience of that, it's like, oh, wow. So now it's like you can listen, you can binge, you can whatever. Now that we're getting back to normal, quote unquote, I like the Mark Twain thing, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, so it's like, and we're kind of rhyming with how things have been, but it's also a new way. But all that poetic stuff aside, like you said, people start to drive more. Bottom line, I know I am, even though we do a hybrid thing, and that average time's 35 to 45 minutes. So how many people have sat in a parking lot waiting for the podcast to finish up? So you've got to try to one consideration, depending on your market and what you're trying to do with your podcast, is you got to fit it in that slot, kind of like the segments on radio where they repeat, even though it's a long drive time show, you're looking at a 30-minute segment or whatever that is that repeats throughout the drive time.
Yeah, that's really important to think through as you strategize around the podcasts. So there are a lot of choices in how you advertise within podcasts. And for those folks who don't know, please explain the difference between dynamic ad insertion, the live reads, regular pre-recorded sponsorship ads, and maybe even the hybrids that are a little bit like a mix.
Yeah, for sure. So, going back in time is the way I like to think of it, is that the first advertisements on radio were live reads because like there's no way to record it and play it back, so so that's the first one I think of. And I think audio, even in those days, even though it wasn't on demand when it was first broadcast, and at a station KDKA in Philadelphia, there's 1,000 sets that are getting it. It's always been intentional. You go to audio, you're turning it on, you're making a decision to go to it, and it's always been intimate. And I think those things are going to remain the same. I think that is part and parcel of audio. And so that's what I lead with: a live read, a host or a broadcaster talking about, or a podcaster talking about a product or service, whether they're directly endorsing it or whether they're just talking about it. They're doing it live into the broadcast. So that'd be the first one that we're talking about. It's like a live read of right now, you go into a break and you're right from this moment into the break talking about the product or service. Another way to do it, and it's from the radio days, is a pre-record. So that would be where you sit down at the beginning of your workday with your producer and you read through all of the pre-recorded scripts that you've got for that day. And it still has that live feel, but it's not going naturally right from the content right into the spot. And then you've got your hybrid ones that feel like they're that way, but they're more pre-produced in advance. And then you talked about dynamic ad insertion. And I think that is a way that ads are delivered. But the other way to think of it is a lot of time that's where maybe what some people refer to as a branded ad, but essentially a produced ad where there's maybe characters or an announcer that isn't identified, or a slice of life or quotes from customers that's fully produced and delivered on some kind of schedule that's bought to go, okay, we've got our live reads, we've got our pre-records, now let's put in our produced spots to be the other type of ad that's out there in the mix.
So it sounds like you and your team have a preference for the stuff where the authenticity of the broadcaster is carried along with that, right? So obviously, from that perspective, it becomes really important into which podcasts you pick from an audience perspective, because you want to make sure that the audience makeup of the podcaster's audience resonates or aligns with at least some portion of the Venn diagram of the marketer, right? So are there tools that can help the media buyer and the strategist sort of recognize which podcasters are going to be a fit culturally, which podcasters are going to be a fit from a demographic or psychographic perspective from their audience, as opposed to just going for tonnage, right? I mean, anybody can go on Joe Rogan and get tonnage, but
True.
You still want to make sure that the audience is a fit. So, what do you recommend people go through with regards to that side of the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different tools that are out there as far as audience goes. The way that we look at it, and like you'd identified earlier, is like, performance is performance. So of course you want to make sure that it's a good fit as far as the audience goes, but there are also these opportunities where you may not think the audience overlaps, but let's say that there have been other advertisers like at Oxford Road where we've got our portfolio of performance to be able to look at and say, oh, this is interesting. This advertiser that may not naturally pick this audience from a fit standpoint, from a performance standpoint, we see that there is overlap. And that kind of goes to, Byron Sharp's work from a few years ago with How Brands Grow, that it's sometimes we can optimize ourselves down to where we're just so hyper focused on a specific audience, on a specific customer, that we miss a lot of light buyers and a lot of opportunities that are outside on the fringes. So I think you can start going like, oh, I'm a new fishing product, so I'm only going to be on fishing shows. But I mean, how many fishing shows are there really? So you've got to broaden out and see, okay, where else can I be that still fits with my brand, but maybe isn't necessarily so specifically tied to my product.
Yeah, you just made me think of a related question, which is, if you went ahead and you've done your sponsorship of a particular podcast, and the host has done probably at this point a dozen different live reads, right? So, and if there's one that the client really, really loves, do they sometimes have the rights to use that ad programmatically across other podcasts?
It's funny. I heard you ask this question in my show prep, Kevin, when I was listening on another episode you did. And I was like, that's really like, I'm like, this guy's got good ideas. Very few people have gone there. And I think it's just that the mechanism or the mechanics of that is like, yes, of course, it would take this like custom negotiation that I haven't seen. So it's cool. I'm like, all right, this guy's good. I dig this. Like, this guy's got cool ideas. But I feel like we've explored that a couple times, and it's just like, is it worth the negotiation and working all that out, or is it just send copy points and get new stuff? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But I love it. I'm
looking forward to having that negotiation at some point myself, with an advertiser. I haven't had that situation happen yet, but I think part of what I would use to try to get the original podcaster to be excited about it is if they're already somewhat of a recognizable name, but they've still got room to grow. Right now, basically, the advertiser is going to say, I'm going to put my money behind your voice in other podcasts. And, we'll do like a 3-second intro spliced into the front of what you said, and we'll use it somewhere else. And we both win. Right. So
yeah, it's possible. You see celebrity endorsements in other mediums. So, that's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
And so it's the question of, do they self-identify? Do they, but something's weird happened. Like I remember we did one once where we had this podcast host that it's like, I remember seeing the Bono interview with Oprah Winfrey, and he seemed so uncomfortable and so like awkward. It's kind of like watching him act in a movie where you're like, oh, he holds court in this certain arena. You get him out of his arena and he's a fish out of water. So these podcast hosts, it's like when they're doing their show and it's their world and they're just in the zone and flow, it's great. And then like we got one where we wanted to like coach them to do a read, and it was like they lost the power of speech. It was, it's like so which is a little different than what you're saying, but I'm just like, they're not actors. But mate, you know what? I love that you think differently about it. And that's going on a bit of just a quick tangent here. Growth in the audio space. Going back to that, these are the kinds of things that like we don't just have to have podcasting become radio,
right?
And go, okay, let's lower this things, up the spot loads, blah blah blah. It's like, man, keep what's made it cool and what's made it interesting, and honestly what made radio interesting, because it was a few decades before it got so formalized, is thinking of things like this, thinking about it differently.
So obviously, given let's say $1 million a month budget would be a nice one, but given whatever budget it is, right?
Right.
The advertiser and marketer can sort of end up with some mix of sort of big shows with lots of reach, and those will be more expensive on a sponsorship basis. And then you've got medium size and you've got small shows that are super niche and might be a little bit more like that fishing podcast that you mentioned,
exactly.
Right? But it doesn't reach that many people, but it's spot on from an audience perspective. So given the fact that each one of those relationships needs to be stewarded and managed, how should a marketer think about, okay, I got X dollars to spend. Like, how much of it do I pump into the sort of big names? How much do I spread around it in the middle? And then will there be some niche ones that I should include in the buy?
It's a good question. And I think that thinking of it from like an investment portfolio standpoint, but before I go there, I think the first really important question when I think of marketing is twofold, which is how are we going to measure success and how long do we have to get there? So first we got to square that away.
Right.
And that could really impact then the next piece, which is the tactical execution from a comm standpoint of going big show, medium show, little show. But I think what you would, just imagine, if we just think about it, even if it was our money we're putting in, ourselves are investing in the market or whatever, is go like, okay, well, I might take a couple big risks on some big shows to get my name out there, if that's part of how you're measuring success and how long you have to get there. But you might find from a performance standpoint, it's going to be mostly a bunch of little shows because all boats rise.
Yeah.
So if I do a whole bunch of little shows where I was saying like that Byron Sharp idea of a bunch of light buyers, and it's sci-fi and comedy and true crime and news and sports and all kinds of news. Are you willing to be all kinds of stuff? You might find you're able to spread it way out and get a result from a performance standpoint. Now, from a awareness standpoint, let's say you were going for that, maybe that's not the play. Then the play is to go with the big shows. But if you were doing some mix, I think like even when you're doing performance marketing, the branding comes free. You're always doing branding. It's this training of the listener. You would naturally go like, okay, I'm probably going to do a big slice that's core stuff that I know is going to work. And that stuff is probably going to be smaller to medium-sized shows. And then I'm going to have a bit that the way I would think of it is like, this is my test budget of like, let me test. And that might be a mix of little, medium, and big shows. And then I'm going to have this piece of my budget that's going to be my kind of let's go for it. And that's where you would either go for it with some different messaging and trying different messaging across all the size of those shows, or do it you're kind of what you're mentioning here, saying what we're talking about, and go like, okay, that's where I do a huge play and I go for some big show with that piece of my budget. Then I've got this middle piece that I'm testing and I'm being measured in my approach. But a big chunk of my budget is about, I need to make sure I'm buying stuff that's going to pencil. If that's how you're measuring success, and you're measuring success within this amount of time, that you need to see that performance immediately.
So thinking back to, when I was doing radio, working at McCann Erickson and J. Walter Thompson, scripts were sacred. right? You'd go into the studio and the script would have been meticulously reviewed. And yeah, sure, there were some folks who did live reads, but even in live reads, they were pretty heavily scripted. Whereas now you've got situations where a lot of talent likes to get the talking points. And even then, they'll pretty much ignore the talking points, right? And do whatever they want. And most marketers actually want that, right? Because of the authenticity. But they may not be comfortable with that because it may be sort of outside of their regular comfort zone. So how have you sort of gotten marketers or brands over that hump, right? Where they typically had sort of a command and control way of thinking about audio advertising. And now they're basically being told, yeah, we're going to try Joe Rogan. And well, he may drop some F-bombs during the spot.
These are good questions. I mean, there's a few layers to that. I would say, first of all, yes, great observation on, over the last probably 3-4 decades of it evolving away from like, thou shalt not even, it's almost like they bring it in with velvet gloves and like here's the copy. The creatives have made the copy. Now we're living this age of evidence-based creative. So it's like, well, show me why that makes sense. Trust him. He said it made sense. It's like, I've got George Lois's book right here, Damn Good Advice. And his whole deal was sort of the genius approach, right? Not the evidence-based, like, how dare you question me? So yeah, it's not as sacred as it used to be because we can see the direct result from the evidence. And then I think, as you're saying, it turning into talking points and letting them vamp. It's interesting. I mean, part of it's like, listen back. Probably some of my biggest advice to marketers, like listening to this wherever you are or however you're doing it, is like, just listen to your air checks. Like, that's what you bought. That is what you bought. That's like, so listen to everyone. If there's somebody on your team with a brain that's engaged, that wants it to win, have them listen to every single one, because you might notice some funky stuff because some of the stuff you're saying doesn't totally bear out. Sometimes hosts are basically saying the exact same thing in every one. And I get it. That is not a criticism. They are human. I am human. I've got to conserve my energy. And so it's like, okay, can you dig in and get them to do more? To your other point, some people will vamp, they'll ad lib, and they will say some incredible stuff. That's where, wouldn't it be nice if we had some kind of tool or some kind of way to create parameters to give them incentive in the marketplace to be brand safe, right? To me, to communicate civilly. And so that's something at Oxford Road with the Media Roundtable that we're involved in, where the name in and of itself, Media Roundtable, how do we create a space where everyone can come together? And with tools like Barometer, where we're able to identify how brand safe a show is. Everybody can see it. Everybody can know. And then you can make an informed decision on, is it worth it to me to give them copy points and let them go off and riff as much as they want. But ultimately, the question of, is it worth it from an investment standpoint to have somebody possibly say something that is incendiary or whatever? I think every marketer has to answer that for themselves. And some brands that makes a lot of sense for, and some brands it just doesn't. And then if it didn't, you could even work with a really big host and be more prescriptive in the language that you give them. But it takes all shapes and sizes, but I think you're spot on in that in general, currently, it is not as sacred as it used to be at all.
Right. Another thing I've noticed in the last few years, and this sort of happened and accelerated during the pandemic, was a lot of folks who started with audio only podcasts actually ended up starting to shoot it as video, either in the studio, back in the studio when people started getting back in the studio, or Zoom based. And they were sort of thinking, well, I've got the record button already pressed. I might as well create 2 different channels, and one will be on my YouTube. The other one will be on, my various podcast platforms. And has that changed the way you guys think about it, knowing that some of it is going to branch out beyond audio? It's going to end up in audio and video form.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a couple different ways. I mean, one is as the agency going that inherently moves it from being just in audio to being in audio and video. And so how else can we think about video and how that's being used for that advertiser and make it fit into their comm system? I think the other piece of it is, man, it's not going to be everybody who consumes it. But like I said before, we're Aristotle, right? 300 BC. We're not fully persuaded until we consider a thing demonstrated. Whew. Audio sure helps us get outside of the theater of the mind, which is very powerful. Don't get me wrong. But now I can hold the thing up.
Right. So
that's super helpful. Sorry, it's super helpful. So to me, that's a huge impact right there.
Yeah. So do you typically, if you know the person's also doing video, do you typically, send the product and ask them to hold it up and showcase it, do their Vanna White moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, as much as you can. That's to me that's the juice, is digging for the most personal connection possible. At Oxford Road, we advertise products that we believe in, would use ourselves. I use as many of them as I can. I wear them, brush with them, whatever. And we look for the same thing with the hosts, so that it is, like I said, audio is intentional and intimate. And they're showing you like Theragun. Like, this is it. I use it on here. Like, you can hear how quiet it is. You can see how big it is.
Yeah.
As much as we can push for that, we want to try to get everybody as excited about it as possible, because the hosts, even like with the dynamic insertion stuff and everything that's changing, it's like the hosts, their relationship with their audience is something we respect. We're renting time on their stage, and so we want to, they're the sales force, and so we want to give them as much hands-on experience as we can provide.
That's great. No, I thought back to the audio only side, right? And particularly as it relates to drive time and people commuting again, and how that changes the way in which you might put in a call to action in your various versions of the creative, in that you don't want the person crashing because they're taking notes on their phone, right?
Yes.
And so you have to think about, like, how do you make the call to action memorable enough that they still remember it when they get home, or when they get to work, or when they're at a red light and they can take notes because that offer was just so good. They need to do it right away.
You just made one of the points right there. First of all, the last thing you said is the offer's so good. That's huge. If you're going to go to the trouble to do an attributable path. Okay. And let's talk about measurement. Why are you doing that way? How long are we, how long do we have to get there? How we measure success? How long do we have to get there? Okay, but fine. I accept your premise. So we're doing a vanity URL. Well, that's probably so that we've got, our Google Analytics, we've got what other directional attribution stuff we're doing with the attributable path, right? You want to look at it as like you've got a multiplier. If I tell 10 people to go to that vanity URL, if it's a really, really, really good offer, it's not just like everything else that they're getting. We know 3 of them are going to do it, but actually 6 went. Like, how do we do? I'm just saying, like, all that stuff is in play. To your question, though, I think, first of all, you got there yourself, which is make it a really good offer. You don't want it to be, hey, if you come to the restaurant and you go around to the back door and you knock on the red door 3 times and you say, "Coco wah," they'll let you in, and and we'll give you free napkins. It's like, oh, wow, I think I'll go through the front door and get the free napkins. You know what I mean? I think another thing to just keep in mind is, like, if it's podcast or Sirius XM, the path is actually more often than not now, as vehicles are changing, is like, it's visually there too. And I like the idea that we are all very responsible drivers with our hands at 10 and 2, and we're not taking notes, and we're looking at the road and paying attention. My heart tells me if other people drive like I do, it's probably not the case. So they're, if it's a good offer, they look at it, they see it. How am I using that information to get them to go to that attributable path? If I'm just using it as one of multiple data points, then it's okay. How hard, you want to make it short. You want to make it meaningful. You want to make the offer better than an offer anywhere else. And if we're doing this, and there's reasons to do this, you want to give it an end date. I need to get this, and there's a compelling reason why, and we're not just gaming them. We're not taking advantage of anybody. It's got a legitimate end date. It's a really good offer, and it's easy to remember. So I think if you do those three things, like David Ogilvy said, the customer's not an idiot. She's your wife. I believe if I'm making a good offer to you, Kevin, and it's something you need, and it's a great offer, and it's a simple thing that you could remember, you will be able to remember it.
Does it take sometimes several impressions for the people to remember? I mean, back in the earlier days of advertising, there was sort of some sweet spots from an impression count perspective, where like you sort of felt like, all right, the first couple are wasted, they're not going to remember unless it's really great, but somewhere between like 3 and 8 is this hot zone, right? And then beyond 8, you're probably wasting your money.
I think 7 is the one that's been bandied about a lot. I think of course I think that the more mental availability that's being taken up by the pressure of whatever the thing is, but I don't know if any of it's ever truly wasted, because I actually think, like Daniel Kahneman stuff, thinking fast and thinking slow, not much gets by any of us. We're all incredibly intelligent and using our minds. So those first couple impressions maybe are just hitting them, but are they taking action right then? No. I think, related to this, if you're testing into the channel, if I may, I think the important thing to keep in mind is if you are testing it, and let's say you do need a frequency of 7 or whatever it is, whatever that team decides, looking specifically at that opportunity, it needs to be, you better give them a reason to act within the time that you're testing, because otherwise you may never find out what the channel's worth, because you're going, is this thing on? Is this thing on? We're going to turn our media off. We're going to turn our media off on November 15th, but we're not going to tell you. So it's like, you know what I mean? It's like, dude, you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's like, tell them it's okay, because you're just trying to get relative value. That doesn't mean every campaign you're ever going to do has to be like that, right? Like, we think of big brand advertisers like Coca-Cola. It's like open happiness and like doing this big higher minded stuff. That's great. But if you look back in the early days, they're doing buy 5, get 1 free. They're the guys that invented the 6-pack. Early on, you have to do those sorts of things to find out what everything's worth, and then you can evolve your messaging.
Right. Well, that's great stuff, Stu. I'm looking forward to seeing how you guys evolve. And, the audio advertising is continuously evolving, and maybe we came up with some new ideas that we'll have a chance to execute on over the next year or so. So let's stay in touch. Thanks so much for joining me.
Absolutely, Kevin. Thank you for having me on.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in the Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.